Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly through the towering stone arches of the ancient library of Alexandria. The moon's a sliver of silver behind a dusty Mediterranean haze, casting long shadows between shelves stacked with scrolls older than most nations. Your feet make no sound on the polished marble. Every torch along the corridor burns low, crackling softly, like they, too, are whispering secrets. There's something off in the air. A warm gust sneaks through a distant crack in the eastern wing, and suddenly, dozens of scrolls tremble in unison, like some invisible hand just ran its fingers down the library's spine. You pause. Goosebumps. One librarian, draped in linen and hunched like he's fused to the weight of memory, is muttering under his breath as he scurries past with an armful of delicate volumes. You catch only one word. Anemos. The Greek word for wind. But also, for spirits. You probably won't survive this, at least not if you forget to duck when the papyrus avalanche starts. Trust me, it gets rowdy when the drafts stir in here. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push open a thick cedar door, the kind that sticks when it rains, and step into one of the quieter wings of the library. Rows upon rows of scrolls curl lazily in their niches, stacked like hibernating snakes. Some are papyrus, others parchment. A few, you're not quite sure what they're made of. They smell faintly of dust, honey, and something sharp, like vinegar, maybe, or old ink mourning its own decay. To the ancient librarians, this space wasn't just a building. It was a body. The scrolls were its lungs, breathing ideas in and out through the centuries. And like any body, it was vulnerable, especially to one enemy above all, the wind. Because here's the thing, wind wasn't just a weather pattern. To them, it was a predator. You kneel by a cracked sill where sea air occasionally slips through, and you watch. A scroll nearby lifts ever so slightly. No one touched it? But there it goes, rising like it's listening to something just outside the wall. In those days, a librarian's worst fear wasn't fire or thieves, it was a breeze with ambition. The older texts speak of scrolls unrolling themselves in the dead of night, whispering into one another's vellum like gossiping ghosts. Of sudden gales that knocked over oil lamps, setting entire sections aflame. And of wind that wasn't wind. Not entirely. Some believed it carried voices. Others thought it erased them. And when you spend every day among scrolls that took decades to copy, each letter inked by hand, every error a potential disaster, you begin to take every flutter of air very, very seriously. Imagine standing on a ladder 15 feet high, reaching for a bundle of histories bound with goat gut, only for the wind to snatch your robe and send you tumbling into a cart of Aristotle's dental records. Not only do you bruise your backside, but now some poor apprentice has to resort 300 scrolls, some of which may have just become intimate with rat droppings. Congratulations, you've angered 3 gods, 2 curators, and a philosopher's ghost. In Alexandria, scrolls weren't just data. They were relics. Each one was a combination of prayer, politics, and panic. And here's a mainstream historical fact to chew on while you sip your tea. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BCE, reportedly held upwards of 400,000 to 700,000 texts at its height. That's not some pokey neighborhood branch, that's the mind of the ancient world, on shelves. Now picture that mind being slowly undone, not by war or flames, but by the whispering, unpredictable breath of the sea. Of course, historians still argue whether the scrolls were as plentiful as legend claims. Some say those numbers are exaggerated, the kind of bureaucratic flex that says, "Our scrolls are bigger than your scrolls." Still, even a fraction of that would make this one of the most precious and vulnerable collections ever assembled. The architecture didn't help. The building itself was designed to breathe. High ceilings, open courtyards, columns shaped like fluted funnels. Great for light. Terrible for air control. Wind snuck in through atriums, tunnels, clerestory windows, and, because the engineers got too clever, through elaborate cooling ducts that sometimes acted more like scroll launchers. One particularly windy day in 241 BCE, a senior librarian named Ptolemaeus the Lesser reportedly got into a fight with a draft. Yes, a draft. His notes, found centuries later under a marble bench, include the words "vile airborne thief" and unraveled Plato mid-sentence. We don't know what happened to Ptolemaeus, but legend says he refused to ever unroll scrolls fully again. He became a cautious half-reader, peeking one column at a time and holding each roll down with ceramic weights shaped like turtles. Those turtle weights still exist. One was excavated in the 19th century, carved with the phrase "keep calm and clamp on" in classical Greek. Okay, that part might be a joke. But they did use weights, often made of polished stone or metal, just to keep pages from catching the breeze. You pause by a window sealed with a thin film of translucent horn, a primitive glass. Outside, palm trees sway under the moon, their leaves clicking like bones. And for just a second, you think you hear something else. Whispers. Faint. Repeating. You press your ear to the horn and realize it's the wind, curling around the library's walls like it's trying to find a way in. Or maybe a way out. Fringe historians, yes, they exist, once suggested that certain scrolls were cursed. That reading them aloud could summon anemoi spirits, who govern the winds in Greek mythology. Especially notice the moist southerly one, known to bring storms, ruin grain stores, and smear freshly scribed ink with damp breath. It sounds ridiculous, until you meet someone who swears their grandfather opened a Roman treatise on wind chariots and woke up with all the hair on his body blown backwards. Coincidence? Or notice having a giggle? Here's the thing. Ancient people understood how dangerous the wind could be, even before they understood weather. And so did the librarians. You reach for a scroll on the shelf of lost cities and feel it tug back, just slightly. Not like it's resisting, exactly. More like it's unsure. You unwrap it carefully, keeping one hand on the weighted end. Inside, a diagram, concentric walls, tiny roads, and a wind symbol in the corner, etched like a warning. The scroll doesn't name the city. It doesn't have to. You know exactly what kind of place leaves behind nothing but echoes and empty air. And as the torches gutter and a soft draft rolls in through the stonework, you finally understand why the old librarians always walked with one hand clenched. They weren't afraid of thieves, rats, or even fire. They were afraid the wind might read. You press deeper into the library now, past rows of scrolls whose ends peek out like ancient tongues, testing the air for moisture or mischief. The ceiling arches above you like a whale's ribcage, huge and echoing, with every creak amplified by 1,000 years of quiet tension. You move slowly, careful not to brush any scrolls from their niches. They don't like that. You reach an alcove where the plaster peels away in pale, curling sheets. The walls are cracked. You can smell the sea here, salt and something older, like ancient glue. A sign above the doorway reads, Historiae Pulvinaris, though the letters are fading fast. Literally cushioned histories, a polite euphemism for scrolls copied by scribes who probably fell asleep halfway through. The dust here is thicker. The scrolls? Even more reluctant to be disturbed. This is where they kept the fragile ones. Not just brittle in form, brittle in soul. The ones that could lose their meaning if the air touched them wrong. The ancients didn't think scrolls were inert. Far from it. Scrolls, to them, were living creatures, delicate, hissing little beasts that needed coaxing. You didn't just grab a scroll and yank it open like a modern pop-up ad. You introduced yourself. Gave it time. Let it breathe. Because in the minds of ancient librarians, scrolls weren't written, they were born. And when you unrolled one, it was like opening its lungs. Papyrus was made by pressing layers of plant stalk together, then pounding it into submission until it agreed to become a page. But even after drying, it still held onto some of that swampy, breathable memory. A scroll might expand and contract with the weather, like a sleeping animal. Get it wrong, too dry, too humid, too breezy, and the thing would curl up in protest or, worse, snap like a breadstick. So, what did librarians do? They whispered. Literally. When unrolling particularly delicate scrolls, scribes and scholars were trained to murmur gently, soft sounds meant to guide the fibers open. Some called it the breath of Athena. Others just called it talking to paper. But here's where things get wild. There's a fringe theory, still debated in scholarly circles, that this whispering wasn't just tradition. It was necessity. Because if you didn't soothe the scroll, the wind might take it. Take what, exactly? Its contents. Some scrolls, they believed, were so volatile, so alive, that a stray breeze could lift the ink right off the surface. It wouldn't vanish. No, worse, it would disperse. Sentences might reappear elsewhere, rewritten across margins of unrelated texts. Meaning unraveled like a dream you half remember. Imagine that, opening one scroll, only to find a paragraph you're certain belonged in another, miles away. Didn't we file the Treaty of Phoenicia under politics? Why is it showing up in a play about erotic pottery? Historians still argue whether this was superstition, poetic metaphor, or ancient librarians being justifiably paranoid. But scroll mixing was a real issue. One gust of air in the wrong direction, and suddenly your list of medicinal herbs is married to a myth about goat-headed river spirits. Good luck separating that later. To counter this, some scrolls were written with double ink, a first layer of carbon black, then a sticky coating of honey wax that sealed the words like armor. It made the text smell slightly of burnt figs and preserved it better than most modern museum techniques. But here's the catch, it attracted insects. So every so often, the wind wouldn't just take the words, it would bring in winged thieves to chew on them. You can picture it now, can't you? A frantic clerk slapping at moths as tiny, sticky bits of aristal flowed around like ash in a sunbeam. The scribes fought back, of course. They didn't just sit there and let the wind steal their work. They designed scrolls with internal anchors, tiny notches and folds that acted like paper breaks. Others used heavier rods, carved from olive wood, to weigh the scrolls down at either end. Still, sometimes it wasn't enough. There's a story, probably fictional, but still passed around, that one master scroll, documenting the lunar cycles of Babylon, was found partially inside another text. Somehow, the ink from one scroll had migrated to a neighboring roll over decades of shared shelf space and poor airflow. When a curious apprentice tried to separate the texts, they re-merged the moment he left the room. He fled, claiming the scrolls were married by wind and should not be sundered. The scribes called it a Librarian notice, a library knot. These were catalogued but never untied. And now, you're sitting cross-legged on the dusty floor, turning one of these reluctant texts in your hands. You dare to unroll a few inches. The page sighs. You swear it flutters, just slightly, even though there's no breeze. Then a sound. A flutter. A cough. Not from you. Something moves at the far end of the room. You freeze. In the doorway stands an apprentice, barely 16, with wide, ink-stained fingers and eyes that have clearly seen things. He doesn't speak. Just lifts one finger to his lips and mouths the word, quiet. Why? Because some scrolls don't like being overheard. These weren't just books. They were contracts between knowledge and silence. Between the scribes and the breathless air. And the wind? The wind was the meddler. The loud uncle at the family reunion who drinks too much and starts dancing on the mosaic table. So, scholars adapted. They designed scrolls with breath channels, tiny slits along the binding rod that allowed a gentle sigh of air to escape as the text was opened. Too fast, and you'd hear a hissing sound, a warning that the scroll was displeased. They trained apprentices to breathe with the scroll. Inhale when opening. Exhale when pausing. A shared rhythm, like monks in meditation. You don't do this because it's spiritual. You do it because scrolls, like cats, appreciate politeness. Now, here's your mainstream fact of the night. Ancient scrolls, particularly Egyptian papyri, were known to be rewritten multiple times. Scholars would scrape or wash off old text and inscribe over it, a practice called palimpsest. This wasn't just economical. Sometimes, it was necessary. Because the wind might rearrange the knowledge. If a scroll's contents were too dangerous, too controversial, or too corrupted by drafts and dust, it would be scrubbed clean and reborn. The whispers of those old words never left, though. People said you could hear them in the cracks between letters. That if you read too deeply, you'd hear two voices speaking at once. The ink you see, and the ink that used to be there. It's at this point that you realize, the fear of the wind wasn't about weather. It was about betrayal. Wind could be a thief, yes. But worse, it could be a liar. Rearranging letters. Smudging meanings. Turning declarations of peace into manifestos for war. What if the king never meant to invade? What if the scroll just read wrong after a stormy night? You rub your thumb over a slightly raised patch in the scroll's center. Ink that once meant treaty now looks dangerously like trap. Oops. So you set the scroll down, slowly, carefully. And as you back away, the apprentice nods. Approvingly. Like you passed a test. He lifts his hand again and traces something in the air. Not a letter? A breath. Because here, among the whispering scrolls and careful lungs of the ancient world, you don't read. You listen. And hope the wind doesn't answer. The hallway narrows now, the smooth floor giving way to a worn stone that dips slightly in the middle, like it's memorized the footsteps of 1,000 sandal-shod scholars. You run your fingers along the walls as you move. The surface is soft with dust, but gritty too. Almost gritty enough to scratch. That's not good. You round a corner and step into what must have once been a scribe's copy chamber. A long, low room lined with benches and tilted writing desks. Every surface is pale with a thin coating of what? Not dust. Dust would be fine. This is ground. Ground into the tables, the scrolls, the air itself. It's sand. Wind-borne sand. And to the ancient librarians, that wasn't just an inconvenience. It was apocalypse in powdered form. If wind was a thief, sand was its blade. You pull your sleeve over your hand and brush away a layer from one of the desks. The wood beneath is carved with names, long-forgotten scribes who must have etched their identities in between bouts of cramping fingers and migraine-inducing calligraphy. Some are deep and jagged. Others are faint, nearly worn away, as if the air itself has been erasing them grain by grain. That's exactly what was happening. The wind, in Alexandria, or any ancient city perched too close to desert or sea, brought more than just air. It carried particles. Tiny grains. Invisible intruders. And those grains didn't just settle, they scraped. Swirled. Nestled into the gaps between scroll layers. Clogged inkwells. Got under fingernails. Into lungs. They were silent killers. Especially of papyrus. Papyrus, as you now know, is tough, but only up to a point. Its layers can peel apart, especially if abraded. So even a soft wind, repeated daily, might begin to shave scrolls bald. Bits of letter edges would wear away. A lowercase alpha would become a lambda. A name would lose its context. A law would become an invitation to civil unrest. Mainstream fact. The Library of Alexandria received texts from all over the ancient world, India, Persia, North Africa, the Greek Isles. Many were acquired hastily, some through confiscation at the docks. A traveler's book might be snatched, copied, and returned within days. And some were never returned at all. The clerks would shrug. Library policy. Now imagine, you copy a delicate scroll from a distant land, the ink still fresh, and place it beside a cracked window, because you're out of space. A week later, you retrieve it, and the letters look like they've been nibbled by ants. Only it's not ants. It's the wind. More precisely, the dust in the wind. Microscopic sand, often laced with salt from the sea, riding the Mediterranean breeze and turning scrolls into parchment-shaped sandpaper. The same way beachware chews the paint off coastal homes, it gnawed the wisdom of the world right off its pages. The scribes tried everything to stop it. First came the ritual dustings. Apprentices swept the scroll walls hourly, using goose-feather brooms that were stored in lavender oil to ward off pests and static. Every wall sweep came with a chant, "Let not the grains rewrite the gods." That might sound dramatic. But remember, if even one sacred word, logos, got blurred or softened, the consequences weren't just scholarly. They were spiritual. You could offend a deity, misquote a king, or render an incantation hilariously inert. Bless the grain harvest might become bake the grain harness. Good luck with that ritual. But it got worse. The dust didn't just hit the scrolls. It settled on the ink. And ancient ink was delicate, especially those formulas involving soot, wine, or beetle resin. Some recipes absorbed moisture, while others resisted it. But none were built to withstand the sandblasting effect of wind over time. One fringe account, dismissed by most but still whispered in papyrologist circles, describes a living scroll, whose ink would migrate when stressed. The particles would dance slightly under strong airflow, like metal shavings near a magnet. Could have been static. Could have been too much time spent sniffing mummification paste. Historians still argue whether this refers to real optical illusion or a side effect of certain inks' chemical instability. Either way, it haunted the scribes enough that they took to storing some scrolls in hollowed-out tortoise shells. Yes, you heard that right. Tortoise shells. You're picturing it now, aren't you? A row of scrolls sleeping like hermit crabs inside exoskeletons. The shells were lined with wax cloth, sealed with waxy resin, and stored inside stone bins. Scrolls inside turtles. An ancient librarian's version of nesting dolls, but angrier. And if that sounds excessive, remember, to these people, knowledge wasn't just a tool. It was a weapon, a prophecy, a passport to immortality. A single scroll might contain a city's genealogy, tax code, and curse formulas, all on the same roll. Lose it, and you didn't just misplace information, you unraveled a civilization's spine. You bend down now and brush some dust from a floor tile. Underneath, something glints. Metal. A bronze scroll weight, etched with a pattern of waves and stars. But not just decoration. This was part of the anti-dust arsenal. These weights were often cooled in water and then set beside freshly inked scrolls. Why? Because cooler metal would attract moisture, and with it, draw the dust to settle away from the ink. Ingenious. Probably ineffective. But points for effort. Of course, no amount of ritual feather dusting or metal charms could hold back the sheer relentlessness of wind-driven dust. Especially not in a building that doubled as a passive air conditioner. Irony alert. Those beautiful fluted columns, open-air walkways, and hollow ducts designed to cool the space by channeling sea air. They were sand superhighways. One particularly grumpy clerk named Charadimos wrote in a marginal note, "If the architect of this place were not already dead, I would gladly bury him in his own ventilation shafts." Cheerful fellow. And here comes the kicker. During certain seasons, particularly just before the Nile floods, there was a phenomenon known locally as the Khamseen. 50 days of dry, suffocating desert wind. A librarian's worst nightmare. During Khamseen, every window was boarded. Scrolls were wrapped in layers of linen. Apprentices wore cloth over their mouths, and scroll reading was suspended entirely. One gust from the Khamseen could turn a whole week's worth of copying into illegible smudges. Scribes who ignored the warnings were sometimes punished with extra duties, such as recopying the Book of Dead Fish Rituals, which apparently smelled exactly as it sounds. You move again, stepping lightly now. Your path is a trail of toe prints in the fine sand. You're trying not to disturb the air, but it's impossible. Even your breath feels like it's contributing to the erosion. You stop by a half-open scroll on a cracked pedestal. The edges are fuzzy. The center is clear, as if time itself has been eating it from the outside in. And there, beside it, a tiny pile of papyrus dust. Golden. Fragile. Gone. Gone like names written on beach sand. Gone like a whisper at the start of a dream. And you realize, this wasn't slow decay. It was murder. By wind. So when the old librarians wore hoods inside, it wasn't affectation. It was defense. When they frowned at a scroll unraveling too quickly, it wasn't stinginess. It was grief. And when they cursed the breeze that knocked open a window latch, it wasn't just annoyance. It was fear. Because here, in the temple of the mind, even the ear could betray you. You shuffle through a narrower hallway now, one that forces you to turn sideways when the scroll racks encroach from either side. It's quiet, too quiet. Not the kind of silence that invites you to rest, but the kind that feels like it's holding its breath. Like it's waiting. You feel it before you hear it, a shift in pressure. A faint thrum in your chest. Then, somewhere far above you, a distant hum, a low groan, almost musical. That's the wind in the ducts. And you're about to meet the scribes who hated it most. These were the foot soldiers of knowledge, the frontliners. The ones who battled not only boredom, ink blots, and eye strain, but airflow itself. They didn't wear armor. Their shields were sanded wax tablets. Their swords were reed pens, hollowed and trimmed from marsh stalks, dipped in ink pots that dried out too fast whenever a draft snuck in through the vents. Scribes versus the air gods. Let's go. You enter a low-ceilinged room with worn benches and built-in cubbies. It's lined with tools of the trade, ink jars in bronze and terracotta, feather brushes, polishing stones, and dozens of pens lined up in strict rows like tiny spears. Most are cracked now. A few still glisten faintly, as if they missed being held. This is where the copying happened. It was all hand-done. No shortcuts. One line at a time. You dip your reed pen, scratch out a few letters, pause to blot the excess. Repeat. Day after day. Word after word. All while praying that no wind dared ruffle your desk mid-stroke. Because here's a mainstream fact. Ancient scribes often worked in open or semi-enclosed colonnades, stone porticos where airflow was encouraged to keep things cool. Practical? Yes. Deadly to ink? Also yes. There's an inscription above the main desk that reads, "Guard thy ink, lest it run like gossip." That about sums it up. You kneel at a writing station and run your fingers over the sloped desk. Grooves are worn into the surface where hands rested for years, maybe decades. Just above that, in a crack between stones, there's a fragment of papyrus. You tug it free. The ink is smudged. The letters lean as if pushed. Almost like they were mid-sentence, and then a breeze hit. You can picture it clearly, a scribe sitting there, deep in thought, transcribing a poem about rain. He's just inked the word nymphia, the sacred lotus. Then a gust, sudden and sharp. The ink bleeds. A blot blooms across the scroll like spilled wine. He groans. Rips up the sheet. Starts over. Again. And again. Some scribes tried to fight back with tricks. One common method, a tiny dish of oil or honey set next to the ink pot. It slowed evaporation and kept the liquid steady, even when the air grew fickle. Another fringe practice? Scented candles, burned near the workspace to thicken the air. Supposedly, the warm, fragrant haze helped trap dust and stabilize the ink. Historians still argue whether this worked or just made everything smell like roasted cinnamon goose. Still, there's something oddly romantic about it. You, a humble scribe in a sunlit hall, surrounded by beeswax, sandalwood, and the low murmur of parchment being trimmed. You're halfway through a retelling of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and suddenly, whump, a breeze. Your candle flickers. Your scroll shifts. You slap down a lead weight and mutter a very unclassical curse under your breath. But you don't stop. You can't. Because the wind won't win today. Here's something wild. In some regions, scribes would carry what were called air charms. These were small clay tokens, pressed with spiral symbols or reed motifs, worn around the neck or hung from ink pots. The belief was that they confused the wind, made it spin on itself or wander in circles. Like tricking a child with shiny objects. One such charm was found near the remains of a collapsed scriptorium in what used to be Cyrene. It bore the inscription, "For the gods of ink and quiet ear." Not exactly mainstream religion, but then again, scribes had their own pantheon. And they needed it. Because wind didn't just ruin ink. It also lifted pages. Picture this, a long scroll, nearly 10 feet unrolled, pinned by 4 weights and still curling slightly at the edges. A gust sneaks in. Just enough force. The middle lifts. And suddenly, the inked section flops back onto itself. Wet ink. Fresh page. Boom. Instant ink smear. Or worse, accidental double exposure. You'd end up with 2 passages overlapping, like voices interrupting each other. Try reading that back and not summoning a grammatical migraine. To avoid this, scribes invented something called the fist frame. It was a loop of oiled twine mounted on a small stick, which they'd place over the scroll like a transparent lid. Not heavy enough to damage the papyrus, but enough to keep it still. Ingenious. Though, according to one complaint carved into the wall of a monastery in Thebes, fist frames do not prevent the wind from being a pompous fool. Some things never change. You glance up now and see a long stone groove near the top of the wall. It's a channel, possibly for drainage. But along the inside, you spot faint scratches. Marks made by something moving repeatedly. A curtain rod? A hanging screen? A wind blocker? Indeed, in later centuries, some scriptoriums started using weighted curtains, drapes soaked in vinegar and pinned with bronze studs to keep out both sun and wind. They'd swing them shut like storm shutters whenever the air felt too curious. One account from the Temple of Horus in Edfu even describes a copyist who refused to work unless his corner was wrapped like a tomb. Did it help? Probably not much. But it gave the scribes a feeling of control. And when you're tasked with preserving human knowledge one sentence at a time, sometimes illusions help. Because here's what no one likes to admit: they were afraid. Afraid that all their work, all those hours spent hunched in silence, shaping symbols from ink and reed, could vanish with one poorly timed gust. That centuries of thought might collapse like a house of cards. That the wind would laugh. You stand now, brushing dried ink flakes from your knees. One lands on your arm. Tiny. Iridescent. A leftover syllable from some forgotten prayer. You don't brush it away. Instead, you look around and see what the scribes saw every day: fragile materials, chaotic airflow, and a constant low-key anxiety that the wind might show up just as you finish a masterpiece. Because in this room, the wind wasn't just an element. It was an editor. And it had terrible taste. The room changes again, narrowing into a curved corridor lined with small stone niches, like cubbies, but older. The air here is different. Staler. Cooler. You notice the walls are thicker, the ceilings lower, as if this part of the library was meant to be insulated not just from the weather, but from something else. This is the night wing, where few ventured after sundown. The oil lamps here are smaller, burn slower. Less oxygen. More whisper. You light one and the flame flickers violently, not from your breath, not from movement. Just the air itself. Shifting. Sneaking. Doing things it shouldn't. You remember what they called it? The Night Watcher's Draft. This was no ordinary breeze. The scribe spoke of it in hushed tones, never quite calling it a ghost, but never quite not calling it that either. It was a presence, a breath, an intent in the air. Something that only moved when you weren't looking, but always made itself known in your periphery. You pass a scroll table carved from a single block of granite. No seams, no creaks. It's unnaturally cold. On top, a scroll lies half unrolled. No weights. No pins. Just open. That shouldn't be. Scrolls didn't do that. Unless someone, or something, unfurled them. You reach toward it. The ink looks dry. No smears. The script is older than most, blocky, and faded. But then you notice something strange. On the left edge, where the scroll curls slightly upward, the letters are mirrored. Not copied. Mirrored. As if the text had been pressed against itself and left there too long. The librarians used to say that when a scroll started duplicating itself, it wasn't a sign of a mistake. It was a sign that the Night Watcher had been reading. And he didn't like to be interrupted. This is where things get weird. Quirky, sure, but also deeply unsettling. You see, the scribes working the night shift, usually junior apprentices or those with poor seniority, swore that when the wind moved at night, it didn't come from outside. It came from within the walls. The old stones had airways, gaps and tunnels from forgotten renovations. And somewhere between the layers of marble and brick, something stirred after sunset. Not wind. Not quite. More like a breath with memory. One apprentice described it as like someone exhaling after reading a long sentence. Another claimed he heard whispered syllables in the drafts, repeating the same phrase over and over in Aramaic. Historians still argue whether these accounts are hallucinations from sleep deprivation or elaborate practical jokes passed between apprentices. Some even suggest low-frequency vibrations, caused by distant waves or city life, might have amplified the sound of airflow through the masonry. Sure. Maybe. But it doesn't explain why, for centuries, scribes carried wind charms during the night shifts. Not to block the wind. To warn them when it was near. These were simple things: feathers hung from strings, shells drilled and set to spin, small parchment ribbons inked with the names of quiet gods. If they moved, you stopped writing. You froze. You watched. Because the Night Watcher didn't like noise. One scribe's journal, recovered during a restoration effort in the 1800s, describes a chilling encounter. The draft came low tonight. It smelled of brine and burning figure. My feather stirred without cause. I closed the scroll, but it had already read me. Read me. That phrase appears multiple times in the margins of ancient manuscripts. Never in the main text. Always in the corners, like someone needed to confess but didn't dare interrupt the page. You reach the end of the corridor and find a small square room. No windows. Just scroll shelves built into all four walls. A single brazier smolders in the center, its heat long faded. This was the meditation room. A place where scribes came to hear their work. They'd read aloud in murmurs, letting the words echo just enough to feel their shape. Not to proofread. To test resonance. Some words, they believed, carried weight. Others carried sound that might linger beyond the page. One mainstream belief in Hellenistic-era scriptoriums was that living words could attract spiritual attention. Reciting certain phrases, especially sacred or magical texts, was considered risky after sunset. Not because of superstition, because the wind might answer back. There's even a famous incident involving a scribe named Lycan who read from that scroll of 4 names at night, alone, without a seal in place. The next morning, the scroll was found tightly rolled, soaked in seawater. The walls of the meditation room had salt streaks on them. The library was miles from the harbor. Nobody explained it. Lycan never worked nights again. Grew a beard. Took up gardening. Even more fringe is the idea that some drafts weren't random at all. They followed you. If you angered the wind, left a scroll open, broke a charm, whispered something too loudly, it would follow you home. You'd wake to find your blanket ruffled, your ink pots tipped, your notes rearranged into anagrams that weren't funny. Some scholars wrote elaborate theories involving air currents, architecture, even underground channels. But the scribes didn't care. They just left offerings. Yes. Offerings. At the end of their shifts, they'd place crumbs of bread, drops of oil, or a feather dipped in honey on the scroll tables. Not to appease any god in particular, just to say thanks. For not knocking things over. For not unrolling the book of disasters again. And tonight, as you sit in that silent, windowless room, you feel it too. The pause between breaths. The slight tickle in your ear. The suspicion that you're not alone, even though the door is shut and the torch is steady. Something in the air is watching. Not with malice. Not even with curiosity. Just waiting. And you remember why the librarians didn't just fear wind because of sand, or ink, or smudged scrolls. They feared the wind because sometimes it knew things. Because sometimes the breeze carried back answers to questions no one had spoken aloud. Because sometimes it wasn't the reader who was reading, but the air itself. There's a back staircase now, spiral, carved into the limestone like someone took a corkscrew to the library's spine. You descend, hand brushing the cold wall for balance. Each step echoes slightly, which is odd, because the air's thick here. Dense. Almost muffled. Like sound itself is reluctant to travel. This is the vault level, where things that didn't behave stayed locked away. It smells different. Less like dust, more like feathers and old wax. Somewhere nearby, water drips in a steady rhythm, like a leaky hourglass. And then you see them. The birds. Not alive. Not anymore. Dozens of tiny bundles, mummified and stacked in neat pyramids along the wall. Doves, sparrows, even a few hawks. Offerings, probably. Maybe pets. Maybe something else. Because in the alcove ahead, past a shelf warped with damp, there's a carving of a pigeon. Wings out. Eyes wide. Beak open, not in song, but as if gasping. This is the aviary nook. And this is where you learn the strangest of all wind-librarian relationships. Pigeons caused wind leaks. And maybe they were stealing. I know. Sounds ridiculous. But bear with me. Carrier pigeons, or rock doves, were common messengers in the Hellenistic world. Alexandria had hundreds, maybe thousands. They roosted in towers, coops, even along library ledges. Messages were tied to their legs, their feet dipped in wax, and off they went, little feathered scrolls with wings. Convenient? Yes. Sanitary? Debatable. But here's where things get curious. Scrolls began to disappear. Not whole libraries. Not dozens at a time. Just fragments. A passage here. A few pages there. Odd symbols missing. Whole metaphors erased. Like someone, or something, was sampling. The librarians blamed the pigeons. Not because the birds were snatching scrolls in their claws, obviously, but because they let in the air. Every time a pigeon returned to its coop, flapping through a designated vent or landing on an open sill, it created a pressure change. A gust. A flap. A burst of feathers and movement that disrupted the delicate airflow inside the library. Just enough for a few scrolls to flutter. Just enough for one to vanish. That's how it started. But then someone noticed something more unsettling. Some of the messages carried by these pigeons were altered. A tax decree sent from a neighboring province arrived with reversed numbers. A love poem arrived as a political rant. Even a set of coded military movements reached a general with its spacing suspiciously changed, just enough to alter the entire meaning. Was it a forger? A rival scribe? Or had the pigeon gotten clever? A fringe theory, scribbled in a now-lost commentary on Ptolemaic logistics, posits that pigeons were occasionally trained to carry not just notes, but tiny, rolled papyrus shavings. Leftovers. Samples from discarded scrolls. Useful for spies. Or smugglers. Or competitive libraries looking to boost their collection count. Historians still argue whether the pigeons were victims of superstition or actual players in some dusty espionage ring. One record from Pergamon accuses Alexandria of using birds to pluck truths from our ledgers. A librarian's Cold War, if you will. So, naturally, pigeons became suspects. Airflow monitors were installed, early ones, just strips of parchment nailed above windows. If they fluttered without cause, the pigeons were blamed. Apprentices were tasked with chasing them away. Some libraries even started using decoy scrolls, filled with nonsense, wrapped in real parchment, placed near open ledgers. Scroll honeypots. You step now into the side chamber where scroll copies were dried after inking. The air is heavier here. You can still smell the old glue, the resin that sealed margins against moisture. One corner holds a rack of thin leather flaps, once used to fan the ink dry. Or, more accurately, to deflect the wind. And above the drying rack? A net. A literal net, stretched over the ceiling like a fisherman's trap, intended to keep birds from perching and, presumably, pooping. It's then that you notice a line of carved images running along the top of the room. Winged creatures, with scrolls tied to their feet. Some pigeons. Some, maybe not. One has too many wings. Another has fingers. The message is clear. Flying things, scrolls, and secrets don't mix well. The fear was never just about the birds. It was what they let in. Because when a pigeon darted through a window, even for a second, it created a vacuum. A shift in pressure that could unroll a scroll, or carry away a flake of ink, or stir the air just enough to loosen the knots of meaning. Some scrolls were stored tightly bound with silk or linen cord. But after one especially suspicious spring, certain librarians insisted on sealing them with wax. Not because of tampering, but because too many scrolls had gone soft overnight, meaning their ends had curled, their edges blurred. Always when the pigeons were most active. Now, here's your mainstream historical tidbit. pigeons were indeed used by various ancient civilizations, Egyptians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans, to relay messages over long distances. Some sources credit them with shaping entire wars through rapid dispatch. But in the fragile ecosystem of the Great Library, where one puff of air could shift entire shelves, they were unwelcome guests. Flying sandbags with feathers. Ink saboteurs. One scholar named Philostratus even wrote a parody play about it, The Pigeon That Read Plato. In it, a rogue bird gains enlightenment from nesting beside a philosophy scroll, then flees the city to start a rival school in Rhodes. Funny? Yes. But also a little too close to real fear. Because what scared the librarians wasn't the loss of scrolls. It was the idea that those scrolls might spread, unapproved. That knowledge might become airborne. Imagine it. Your most carefully guarded scroll, your life's work, caught by a gust triggered by a flapping pigeon and carried out over the sea, never to be read again. Or worse, read by someone who wasn't ready. That was the nightmare. Not destruction, but misdelivery. Which is why, late in the library's history, scribes began writing delivery anchors into the first and final lines of scrolls. Not curses, exactly, but phrases that said, in essence, you are not meant to read this unless you were meant to. One such scroll begins, the wind has not earned this truth. Another ends, may you find silence before these words speak. So now, as you stand here, beneath the bird-netted ceiling, between scrolls so delicate they quiver at your shadow, you realize how fragile it all was. Not because of violence, but because of pigeons. Because of flapping wings. Because of tiny changes in the air. And because sometimes, the wind doesn't need a storm. Sometimes, all it needs is a feather. You push open a warped cedar door, its hinges sighing like an old man remembering past regrets, and step into a wing of the library that smells immediately wrong. It's damp. Clammy. You instinctively rub your arms, not from cold, but from a thick, sticky humidity that clings to your skin like invisible spiderwebs. The air in here doesn't move the way it should. It drifts. It coils. It sits. Welcome to the Scroll Infirmary, the place where sick texts were brought when they began to rot. Yes, scrolls could rot. And when they did, it wasn't because someone sneezed on them, or dropped them into a basin of soup. No, the rot came from something more sinister, something subtle. It came from the air. Specifically, moisture. And worse, salt. You move through the chamber slowly, careful not to brush the long tables laid out with drying parchment and papyrus. These scrolls are pale, brittle, some tinged with green fuzz. Others are wrapped tightly in gauze soaked in what smells like vinegar and fig resin. And above them all, swirling almost imperceptibly from the vents in the ceiling, is the culprit. The desert wind. Only, this time, it's wet. You see, Alexandria may have been kissed by sun most of the year, but its close embrace with the sea meant that not all wind arrived dry and dusty. Sometimes, particularly in spring and autumn, the air rolled in low and slow, carrying salt, sea mist, and damp. That combination was deadly. Because here's your mainstream historical fact: papyrus and parchment are hygroscopic. That means they absorb water from the air. Even slight humidity can make scrolls swell, warp, or delaminate. And that, in turn, invites mold, fungus, bacteria, things with names too long to whisper at night. And once mold enters a scroll, it doesn't just stain, it eats. Whole chapters vanish beneath creeping mildew. Ink liquefies and runs like mascara in a soap opera. Parchment peels apart in soggy flakes that smell like spoiled milk and regret. The rot had many names. The silver sweat. The salt wound. One particularly poetic clerk dubbed it scroll rot. Very direct. Very accurate. You pause by a scroll laid flat on an obsidian slab. It's covered in translucent skin, an ancient bandage. Through the cloudy surface, you can just make out faded lettering. Greek, maybe. Or Latin. But the middle portion? Gone. Not erased. Dissolved. This one never stood a chance. Historians still argue whether the scroll rot incidents were due to architectural flaws or Alexandria's cursed love affair with open-air designs. Either way, the result was the same: precious texts, once safe and solid, slowly melting from within. So the librarians fought back. They moved the weakest scrolls into quarantine wings like this one, rooms with limited airflow, stone walls, and low, controlled lighting. But the real war? That was chemical. They treated the scrolls with salt-soaked linen, iron gall, fig paste, vinegar vapor, and, yes, goose fat. A fringe formula from a temple in Cyrene involved boiling goat bones with lavender, mashing the result with olive oil, and applying it with a feather brush. If nothing else, the scrolls died smelling fabulous. You turn a corner and discover a wall carved not with words, but with lines. Tally marks. Rows upon rows, scratched in pairs and quartets and fives. Each one labeled with a tiny scroll symbol, like a gravestone. This was a death ledger. A memorial for lost texts. They even had a chant for it, whispered at dawn by the keepers of the infirmary. What was written once shall return in wind or breath. It was part faith, part superstition. Because, at a certain point, some scribes began to believe that scrolls didn't die. They evaporated, became part of the air, dispersed their knowledge into the currents. One fringe theory claimed you could inhale a lost scroll if you stood in the right place during the right breeze. There's no evidence this worked. But people tried anyway. Some scribes stood on the roof at night with damp cloth over their mouths, trying to read the air. Others pressed their faces to vents, hoping to dream of lost knowledge. One guy even stuffed rotten papyrus into a pillow and slept on it. He got a rash and no answers. So, mixed results. But the fear was real. Because the wind wasn't just bringing in rot. It was recycling it. See, once a scroll started decaying, the air could carry fungal spores to the next shelf. One infected scroll could take out an entire wing if left unchecked. And unlike fire, which is dramatic and obvious, scroll rot was slow, creeping, patient, and worst of all, it smelled sweet. That's what the librarians hated most. The betrayal of the senses. You'd walk into a room and think, ah, lavender and figs, and by the time you realized it was scroll rot setting in, it was too late. So they developed early warning systems. Tiny bowls filled with reactive powders, chalk, copper, crushed rose petals, placed along shelves. If the air shifted, if moisture climbed, the powder would clump or discolor. That meant lockdown. Immediate sealing of scrolls, fireballs lit to dry the air, sometimes full evacuations. You walk now through a short passage with sloped walls, ending at a double door engraved with lotus blooms and what looks like mold spores. Yes, mold. Someone even carved them lovingly, little puffy clouds of doom. Inside, the cold chamber. Not cold like snow. Cold like grave. This room was built deep, insulated with clay brick and lined with thick cedar shelves. The scrolls here are bound in wax cloth, double-wrapped, some sealed in terracotta tubes. This was the final line of defense. If a scroll made it here, it was sacred. And in danger. They called them the wilting ones. No one spoke inside the cold chamber. Not for superstition, but practicality. Breath added moisture. Even a whisper could shift the air. So when scribes entered, they wore linen masks, walked barefoot, and held their breath when unsealing a tube. Inside each scroll, knowledge hanging on by a thread. And sometimes, even that wasn't enough. One record speaks of the sudden bloom, where 200 scrolls were lost overnight to an aggressive fungal wave. Another tells of a scroll that rewrote itself, its words shifted, blurred, until the entire text read as a single phrase. We were not meant to be read. Probably a hoax. Probably. You pause at a sealed tube with a burned-in label, Nautical Contracts of the Third Pharaoh. It's unopened. Untouched. Probably unread for 1,000 years. And still, it sits here, waiting. Because if they tried to read it, and the air was wrong, it might dissolve before the first line. That was the gamble. That was the fear. That even preservation was temporary. That even the most protected scroll could succumb to air made slightly too damp, too warm, too salty. That knowledge had an expiration date. One gust at a time. You leave the cold chamber slowly, letting the heavy door close behind you with the soft finality of a tomb. The silence that follows is thick. Humid. You swallow instinctively, your throat dry despite the moisture in the air. The corridor you're in now is lined with tiny wall vents, just wide enough for a finger, just tall enough to let in trouble. This is where the architects got clever. And also careless. You follow the faint trickle of water along the stone floor, your sandals whispering with each step. Somewhere ahead, a drop lands, plink. 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 Like a clock, ticking down to disaster. Because what the desert couldn't do with heat and sand, and what the sea couldn't do with salt and mist, the dew point could accomplish silently, efficiently, and repeatedly. Welcome to the library's secret enemy, condensation. Or as the scribes called it, the quiet mold. You pause in a junction chamber where 4 corridors meet under a vaulted ceiling. It's cool here. Too cool. A carved lion's head juts from the wall, mouth agape, not roaring, just yawning. You glance up. And there, tracing the curve of the arch, are dark streaks. Moisture lines. It's happening again. You see, in ancient Alexandria, architectural brilliance often collided with environmental ignorance. The library's designers wanted light, airflow, and passive temperature regulation. So they built with porous stone, created ducts to carry wind, and buried parts of the structure to keep it cool. Which worked, until it didn't. Because when warm, humid wind from the sea met cool marble and limestone walls. Condensation. And when that moisture pulled behind scroll racks or gathered in floor cracks? Fungus. Mold. And more than once, collapse. You push open a screen and step into a reading chamber. The walls here are green with age, literally. Vines of algae creep along the stonework, fed not by rain, but by the sweat of the walls themselves. The air is muggy, close, like a room exhaling in your face. This was supposed to be a preservation zone. Now it's a botanical garden of microscopic invaders. A scroll lies abandoned on a table. You touch it. The parchment tears like wet paper. The scribes called this stage the wilt. Mainstream historical fact? The ancients weren't totally helpless. They knew temperature shifts could cause condensation. In Egyptian temples and Roman baths alike, they saw it form. They even built domes with weeping holes, tiny drainage points, to help water escape. But Alexandria's library? It wasn't just a temple. It was a sponge. Its walls soaked up the sea wind all day. Then, when the temperature dropped at night, they released that moisture inside, coating scrolls with an invisible film of doom. Scribes tried drying rooms. They burned incense not for the scent, but for the heat. They even laid floors with volcanic ash to wick the breath of the walls, as one poet scribe put it. Did it work? Occasionally. Until the dew point betrayed them. Fringe idea? Some scribes believed that certain scrolls sweated guilt. That knowledge too heavy with sorrow or secrets would draw water from the air to protect itself. A scroll on ancient punishments, for instance, was always found damp, no matter the chamber. Another, titled The Sky Ritual of the Dead King, was so moisture-prone it was wrapped in waxed ox hide and sealed in a bronze cylinder. It still grew moss. Historians still argue whether these effects were due to specific inks, unusual scroll fibers, or just bad placement near vents. But the pattern held. And the fear deepened. Because here's what made this so terrifying: you couldn't see it coming. Fire crackled. Wind whistled. Rats scratched. But condensation? It just sat there. Silent. Creeping. Unstoppable. One scroll might grow a soft ring of mold around the edges, like a halo of decay. A week later, that scroll would be soft. Blurry. A week after that? Powder. Airborne again. You reach a corner now where a copper bowl catches drips from a ceiling crack. The bowl is green with age. Inside it, a small reed weight bobs lazily. A moisture monitor. These were common in the later years. Bowls filled with water, placed beside scroll stacks, to measure evaporation and leaks. But they were also offerings. To dryness. To whatever wind would come to carry this water away. Because in those final centuries, the wind wasn't always an enemy. Sometimes, if it was dry and warm, it was a savior. That rare breeze from inland that would chase away the sea breath, sweep through the scroll halls like a priest with a censer. The scribes called it the broom wind. They even named it. Its glyph, 3 parallel lines crossed by a rising spiral, appears on charms hung from scroll rods. May the broom wind pass through, they whispered. May it leave no damp behind. But the broom wind was shy. It came rarely. More often, you got the sighing wind, a wet, reluctant gust that left beads of dew on every surface. That's what this room feels like now. A sigh that never ends. You notice now a scroll tube cracked open on the table. Its labels faded, but inside, you see dark fuzz, spores. You sneeze. The sound is almost violent in the hush. And the air seems to respond. Not with a breeze, but with a drop. Plink. Right onto the scroll below. You flinch. Because in the scribe's training manuals, one line appears again and again. One drop may rewrite a king. A wet dot on parchment could shift ink. Turn names into nouns. Numbers into nonsense. 10,000 men into 10 men. Do not go into do now go. Words blurred. Stories changed. History shifted. So they began double inscribing. In some important scrolls, each line was shadowed by a faint echo, an underline in pale ink that would only become visible when wet. A backup. A fail-safe. But even that failed if the air got too heavy. So they tried fanning scrolls during reading. Invented hand-cooling gestures, what we'd now call scroll tai chi, meant to reduce reader heat and prevent localized condensation. One monk in a later Coptic monastery was famed for never sweating while reading. They thought him a holy man. Turns out, he read only in the driest season. Smart guy. You pause at a low window now. Outside, the sea glimmers under moonlight. A boat passes, its lantern bobbing like a firefly. And in the glass pane, rare, thick, clouded, you see it. A bead of water sliding down the inside. Your chest tightens. You wipe it away with a finger, revealing your own reflection in the smudged glass. And for a moment, it looks like someone else is watching with you. A trick of light. Or maybe not. Because the Jew has eyes. It sees what scrolls cannot. It slips into the fibers of truth and leaves only interpretation behind. And you finally understand why the librarians didn't fear the flood. They feared the drip. Because at least a flood was honest. The hallway climbs now, shifting upward in a slow, sloping ramp barely wide enough for two scribes to pass shoulder to shoulder. Your feet echo lightly with each step, and the air grows drier, thinner. The moisture-soaked air of the lower levels fades behind you, replaced by a strange stillness. You're entering the upper chambers now, designed with intelligence, arrogance, and a dash of theatrical flair. These were the reading rooms for the elite. The philosophers. The astronomers. The visitors too important to get scroll rot on their tunics. You expect open spaces. But what you find instead is a maze of doorways and corners that twist and turn in deliberate confusion. And suddenly you realize, this isn't a floor. It's a trap. Not for people. For wind. You step into the central gallery, and it hits you. This room was designed not to breathe, but to confuse the air. High windows face away from prevailing breezes. Columns aren't symmetrical. Doorways don't line up. There are nooks that go nowhere, and walls that seem placed to catch nothing at all. It's like a funhouse built by introverts with a vendetta against weather. Welcome to the wind traps. The architects, after decades of watching scrolls fly, ink run, and ancient parchment curl into mummified frowns, decided, if we can't stop the wind, we'll get it lost. This space is the result. A chaos of curves and cul-de-sacs meant to break airflow into confusion. A breeze that entered here would twist, rebound, disperse, and, hopefully, dissolve before it could do any damage. Clever, right? Mostly. Here's a mainstream historical fact for you. The architects of the Library of Alexandria were influenced heavily by Egyptian, Greek, and Persian design principles. They knew how to use stone to cool rooms, how to angle courtyards for airflow, and how to build passive ventilation. But sometimes they pushed too far. And in doing so, they turned architecture into an act of war. Against the sky. One account from a late-period builder describes the wind-trap wings as a monastery for directionless air. Another compared it to a maze where the breeze forgets who it is. But it wasn't just physical design. They also employed sound. You hear it now, faintly. A low hum, almost a moan, curling through the gallery like a musical sigh. You follow the sound to a stone arch where a shallow alcove hides a thin slit in the wall. Not wide enough to see through. Just enough to let wind in, and turn it into music. Yes. Music. The librarians discovered that if they couldn't stop the wind, they could change it. So they carved grooves, placed reeds in ducts, hung strings across vents. Wind would enter, and instead of wreaking havoc, it would sing. Fringe detail? Some claim certain scrolls responded to the songs. That a hum in the right key could keep a text from curling. Others believe the tunes calmed the scrolls, pacified the ink. Historians still argue whether this was real science or early ASMR. You press your ear to the vent. The sound is strangely soothing, almost like breath. But deliberate. Controlled. A librarian's lullaby. Further down the corridor, you come upon a set of double doors carved with swirling lines, whirls and spirals that repeat with subtle asymmetry. They pull your eyes in, make your head spin slightly. Above the doors, a phrase is etched. Let the air forget its name. This was the wind confusion chamber. You enter. The room is circular, but not perfectly. Slight ovals, split angles. The windows are set at different heights. The ceiling is curved but dips in odd places. There's a central stone pillar covered in carvings, glyphs that flow like a river of nonsense. The idea? Disorientation. This was a place where scribes could read safely even on breezy days. Because if the wind entered, it wouldn't know where to go. It would stall, drift, die. In the center is a scroll table built like a starfish, 5 arms extending out, each ending in a scroll cradle. The table turns, rotates gently on a sunken pivot. This allowed scribes to shift their work toward or away from the breeze, depending on the wind's behavior. You reach down and find a dial beneath the edge. It's marked not with numbers, but with wind names. North, south, broom, sighing, ghost, and one simply called him. Nobody ever wrote down who he was. Just that if he showed up, you stopped reading. One scroll fragment in a storage chamber nearby states, he arrives without entry. Leaves nothing but missing names. Charming. So yes, this room was safe. But at what cost? Because there was a side effect to all this wind confusion. The air stopped leaving. Without proper circulation, the rooms grew stale. Ink fumes built up. Mold grew in hidden corners. Scrolls that didn't flutter, slowly fermented. Some gained new smells. Others darkened. A few warped like wet leaves dried in strange shapes. And, every once in a while, a scribe would faint. Too much air turned wrong. The solution? Microvents, tiny pathways leading back down into lower chambers, carefully placed to draw off heavy air while still disorienting incoming breezes. It worked. Kind of. But even this wasn't enough to satisfy the truly paranoid. So they built scroll closets, sealed cabinets with internal airflow traps. You'd place a scroll inside, close the door, and the vent system would create a vacuum seal-like stillness. Perfect for preserving fragile texts. Unless, of course, the scroll inside wanted to breathe. You see, fringe beliefs popped up here too. Some scribes claimed certain scrolls couldn't be sealed without suffering. That the ink would fade faster, that the parchment would dry out in loneliness. One scribe even reported hearing a whimper from inside a locked cabinet. Scroll or apprentice? Who can say? But the belief held. That wind was not just danger, it was company. That total silence might undo a text just as surely as too much breeze. So now, as you sit in the wind confusion chamber, surrounded by brilliant absurdity, you realize something vital. The librarians weren't just defending against wind. They were negotiating with it. Tricking it. Luring it. Begging it to pause, not forever, but just long enough for a sentence to be copied, a name to be preserved, a truth to escape ink's fragility. Because in this strange temple of twisted corners and breathless rooms, one thing was always certain. If the wind knew where it was going, it had already won. The wind confusion chamber fades behind you as you pass through a narrow arch shaped like a keyhole, the stone worn to the touch, worn smooth by centuries of fingers, robes, and worry. You emerge into a passage dimmer than expected, even though the torches along the walls still flicker. The light doesn't stretch far here. It's swallowed. Not by darkness. By something else. Air. Thick, strange, moving air. Not fast. Not loud. But present. It stirs your hair, brushes your cheek, raises goosebumps on your arms. And something else happens. The scroll beside you shifts. Just a twitch. But you see it. You're in the sacred shelving corridors now, the ones scholars rarely wrote about, because, well, what was there to say? They were just shelves, right? Wrong. They were alive. Not literally, but close enough. The ancient librarians believed that air got trapped in the shelves. Not around them. Inside them. Between scrolls. Between words. And when that air moved, when it escaped, it didn't just rustle paper. It spoke. This was the domain of what the scribes called the shelf gods. Small, invisible deities who lived between the racks, hiding in the dust, the cobwebs, the woodworm tunnels. Not malicious, but easily irritated. Especially by wind. Especially when it whistled. You pause before one shelf, labeled in a shaky hand. Epics, divine, questionable. Great title. Even better content. But above it, you notice something. A faint chime, dangling. From a thread nailed to the wall. Not decorative. Functional. You blow on it gently. It doesn't move. Only the wind can ring it. These were the spirit bells, placed by scribes who swore that the shelf gods warned of coming drafts, not with words, but with music. If the chime sounded without breeze or movement, you stopped what you were doing. You left. Quietly. Historians still argue whether this was based on legitimate airflow mapping, some proto-understanding of pressure systems, or just the ancient version of, when in doubt, blame the shelves. Either way, no one risked it. Because when the air between the shelves stirred, it didn't just move scrolls. It moved memories. There are stories, half myth, half footnote, of scrolls that change depending on where you read them. Open one in the north wing, and the tale ends in tragedy. Read it near the southern shelves, and it ends in hope. Same scroll. Different shelf. Different air. Fringe idea? That the shelf gods rewrote endings depending on their mood, or on how respectful the reader had been during the previous chapter? A strange form of literary karma, delivered by humidity, temperature, and whatever else lived between the niches. To avoid angering the shelves, librarians developed rituals. One involved whispering the scroll's title before removing it. Another? Placing a pebble on the shelf where the scroll came from, so the wind wouldn't forget it belonged there. And if you forgot, you might return the scroll to the wrong spot, and it wouldn't read the same ever again. You kneel by a shelf marked with a 7-point star. Inside, the scrolls are bound in red twine, emergency copies. Backup versions of sacred texts, copied in haste during one of Alexandria's many wind crises. These scrolls weren't just ink and fiber. They were bruised. Some bear watermarks. Others have jagged ends, as if ripped mid-reading. And one is singed along the edge, not from fire, but from friction. That's what they called it, air burn. When scrolls snapped closed too fast. When wind slammed them shut like petulant toddlers. The friction heated the ends. Not to flames, but enough to scar. You pull one gently. It opens, reluctantly, like it remembers being mistreated. The words are faint, faded, but legible. A story of a priest who could trap winds in his mouth. He'd speak a storm into a clay jar, cork it, and store it on a shelf. Each jar labeled with the wind's name. You glance at the wall. There are jars. Empty, but sealed. And every single one has a name scratched on it. North Whimper. Tomb Draft. She who flickered the lamps. You didn't come here for ghosts, but they came for you. And now the air moves again. Gently. Between the scrolls. A sigh between sentences. A whisper that isn't quite a whisper. Just a thought, maybe. An old one. One that never left the shelf. Because you realize, this wasn't just superstition. It was survival. The librarians treated air like a being. They learned where it pulled. Where it rushed. Where it slowed. They placed heavier scrolls on outer shelves, lighter ones inside. Not for organization, but for wind buffering. They even staggered the scrolls, each one placed slightly forward or back from its neighbor, to break line-of-sight airflow. Like wind camouflage. And it worked. Mostly. Until she showed up. That's what they called her. The whirling spirit. Not a goddess. Not a ghost. Just wind that made decisions. One afternoon, a junior scribe named Melanian opened a shelf, and the wind knocked every scroll off it. Just that shelf. Nowhere else. No doors open. No windows cracked. Just that one moment of intention. He spent 6 days resorting the scrolls. And the next time he passed by, the shelf was empty again. So the librarians gave her offerings. They lit small clay lamps, windproof, with curved lids, and left them at the base of the worst shelves. They sang lullabies. Soft ones. Old ones. Meant not for comfort, but for calming. Because the wind, when irritated, could be petty. And scrolls, when unsettled, could hide their truths. You spot a carving now, at the end of a row, of a man blowing into a scroll, cheeks puffed like sails. Below him, a warning. Ink may run. Names may flee. The breath will remember. You don't dare speak. Instead, you listen. You crouch, head between shelves, and let your breath grow shallow. And yes, there it is. A flutter. Not nearby. Inside. Not a breeze. A shift. Because this is the truth. Scrolls are not just vessels. They are lungs. They take in air. And they exhale memory. The shelf gods don't want worship. They want respect. So you rise slowly, return the scroll to its exact place, offset by 1 finger width from the one beside it. The air feels steadier now. Balanced. Acknowledged. And as you turn to go, you don't look back. Because the wind between the shelves is reading you too. You exit the shelving corridor with a quiet sort of reverence, the way you might leave a sleeping child's room, or a den of small, invisible predators you've just barely made peace with. The air shifts again. Less sacred now. Less spiritual. But not less dangerous. The corridor you enter is wider than the others, lined with benches and small desks. There are ink stains on nearly every surface, faded in overlapping generations of brown and black blotches. At a glance, it looks like nothing special, just another reading hall. Until you notice the stains on the walls. Not random. Not scattered. Running. Like streaks. Like trails. Ink. That's when it clicks. This is where it happened. This is where the ink began to flee. You cross the room slowly. A breeze coils through a high, cracked window above the archway, just enough to raise the hairs on your arms. You look at the nearest scroll on the bench. It's open. Not new. Not ancient. But the letters. They've shifted. The ink hasn't just faded. It's moved. Smeared into soft shadows. Drifted away from the original lines. One word has melted downward, its letters sliding like a forgotten candle in the sun. You've just stepped into one of the library's quietest crises. The war on ink. Mainstream historical fact? Ink in the ancient world was far from standardized. Egyptian scribes used carbon-based inks, mixing soot with gum arabic and water. The Greeks often added wine, vinegar, even fig juice. Romans later dabbled with iron gall inks, acidic and long-lasting, but corrosive over time. It was chemistry by instinct, and the results were often beautiful, but delicate, and completely at the mercy of one particularly sinister force. Unstable wind. Not violent gusts. Not storms. Just the wrong kind of air. Humidity too high? Ink would bloom, spreading out into feathery halos. Too dry? It would crack, flake, detach like dandruff. And a steady, sneaky draft could dry only one edge of a freshly inked scroll, creating a pull, a drift, a slant in every word. What started as elegant script became ghost writing. The scribes called it ink fleeing the page. Fringe reports tell of a cursed scroll, the list of twin emperors, so sensitive that even a sigh could send its letters running. It said a student once tried to read it while eating a fig. One gentle exhale across the parchment and poof, 3 names vanished. To this day, no one agrees who actually ruled that summer. You stop by a sealed display case, cracked open slightly. Inside, a scroll wrapped in oilskin and tied at both ends with reed cord. Its label reads, "Epistle to the air, handle only when breathless." Poetic, but practical. because some scrolls weren't just reactive, they were aggressive. Here's a true oddity. The ink used in spells, rituals, and curse scrolls often contained metallic elements: copper, mercury, even arsenic. Not enough to kill, but enough to make the ink react. To light, to moisture, to heat, to air. One account from an apothecary scribe describes a scroll that began smoking when read too close to a vent. Another reportedly hissed. The librarian blamed it on mold. The reader never came back. You kneel beside a bench where someone's copied work still rests, a reed pen brittle with age beside it. The text is fragmented, something about fish gods and navigational curses, but one thing is clear. Every letter leans downhill. Every single one. Blown that way. There's no way that's a coincidence. Scribes eventually adapted. They tested airflow before writing, using scraps of ink parchment left overnight. If the lettering shifted, they'd declare the room tainted. Some used ink stiffeners, beeswax, powdered bone, but that made the lines raised, thick, more vulnerable to cracking. Others tried breath buffers, like placing bowls of cold vinegar near their desks to trap humidity. One even attempted to write upside down, believing the ink might cling better to defiance. Historians still argue whether this was real technique or performance art. You touch one scroll lightly. It's coated in something sticky. Resin? No, egg white. Albumin was used in some regions to seal ink. Effective, but brittle. A single breeze, you realize, could crack the glaze. And the ink would crumble with it. So the librarians fought the breeze with architecture. More ducts, fewer windows, but they also fought it linguistically. Enter anchorglyphs. Tiny, invisible symbols written beside or underneath keywords. Not meant to be read. Meant to hold. They acted like weights, scribbled in pale ink, or etched faintly into the parchment before writing. Like nails hammered beneath a rug. Fringe idea? Some say these glyphs weren't just aesthetic or symbolic, they had rhythm. That if a scribe hummed while writing them, the ink settled deeper. Ink that sang, they called it. Only a few survived. One scroll, the names of the eclipses, shows faint dot and slash markings beside every name of power. The scroll never smudged. Even during the Great Vent collapse of 114 BCE. Coincidence? Who knows? But the fear remained. Because ink wasn't just pigment. It was memory. It held deals, promises, pacts. If it fled the page, then so did truth. So did history. So did accountability. There's a famous marginal note, scribbled by an exhausted archivist, that reads, "When the ink runs, the blame forgets its home." You pause by a desk where a glass bottle lies on its side. Dried residue along the rim. Ink, yes, but also oil. Aromatic. You sniff. Frankincense. Some scribes blended their ink with scented oils not for flair, but for density. Heavier ink stayed grounded. Didn't drift. Didn't fly. But it also dried slower. And there lay the final trap. Because the ink might stay grounded, but the scroll might shift. Just one curl. One tickle of breeze under the parchment. And the letter would slip. Slide. Smudge. So they did what desperate artists have always done. They prayed. There are recorded invocations to Thoth, Hermes, Even minor deities like Seshat, goddess of libraries, records, and scribal precision. One particularly beautiful prayer, found etched on a scribe's lamp base, reads, "Still my hand, shield my ink. Let my truth anchor in breathless air." A moment of faith, whispered between blots and drafts. You light a nearby lamp now, its flame low and steady. And you watch. You wait. And yes, there it is. The ink beside you, dry for centuries, catches the warmth. And lifts. Not much. Just a flake. A shimmer. A memory, airborne. Gone. Because here in this room, ink is still trying to escape. And the air is still listening. You make your way down a white hall now, carved with motifs of ships, stars, and mathematical grids. The light changes. Dust shimmers in long slanted shafts, drifting lazily like it's got nowhere else to be. It's beautiful. And then you round a column and gasp. It's chaos. Scrolls everywhere. Piles of them. Some intact, others splayed open like startled birds. Ink-streaked weights lie scattered across the floor. One chair is overturned. A tall ladder leans at an awkward angle, as though it gave up halfway through collapsing. This is not a room. This is the aftermath of a scrollquake. And the culprit? One rogue gust of wind. They called it the Great Scroll Stampede. A legend in the library's oral tradition. Most scholars dismissed it. Some even laughed. But the janitor scribes? The interns? The apprentice who still walked with a limp? They remembered. Because it wasn't a fire. It wasn't a theft. It wasn't a flood. It was a domino cascade of ancient scrolls, toppling from shelves in a chaotic chain reaction triggered by one gust of air that didn't know when to stop. You pick your way through the room like a cautious archaeologist. Scrolls crunch underfoot. Not papyrus, those were moved out years ago. These are parchment. Animal skin. Thicker, tougher. Still fallen. One scroll is still half open. The text lists naval inventories for an ancient armada, triremes, rowers, provisions, and 26 barrels of salted boar. All perfectly catalogued. Except someone's sandal print now obscures most of it. A tragedy. According to surviving notes, it happened during what was supposed to be a routine vent cleaning. A team of workmen removed a faulty copper window verter in one of the upper domes, just for an hour, just while they polished it. That's all it took. The chamber below, known for its curved walls and open shelving, suddenly breathed for the first time in a decade. Not coughed. Not sighed. Breathed. The wind whooshed in. And 3,000 scrolls took flight. There were accounts of scrolls curling midair like diving birds, of open text spinning like wheels, of weights bouncing across the floor with enough force to bruise. And yes, one scholar reportedly was concussed by Herodotus. Specifically, the Histories, Volume 6. That's what did it. Hit him squarely in the temple. They say when he woke up, he spoke perfect Phoenician for 4 minutes, then forgot how to tie his sandals. Recovery was slow. You glance up. Above you, the ceiling dome still bears the scars. A radial crack runs from the central vent outward, like a spider web frozen in stone. Below it, a spiral of lighter-colored shelving marks where the cascade began. The first shelf to fall. The first scroll to fly. They say it was a text on wind measurement. Ironic. Mainstream historical fact? Ancient libraries often had to deal with architectural wind corridors. Roman libraries in particular suffered from sudden breezes due to the use of hypocausts, underfloor heating systems that also vented air upward. One bad adjustment in airflow could unbalance everything. But Alexandria had the sea. And when the air got excited, it didn't just tip over ink bottles. It launched a paper tornado. The scribes tried to make light of it afterward. They gave names to the incident: the scroll cyclone, the spiral of regret. One apprentice wrote a poem called The Lament of the Loose Leaf, and yes, it rhymed poorly. But the damage was real. Entire organizational systems lost. Categorizations undone. Some scrolls were never identified again, reclassified as anonymous because the titles had literally blown off. And some weren't recovered at all. Fringe theory? That a few rare texts may have been lifted so high during the stampede they got caught in the upper latticework of the dome, and were never seen again. One scribe claimed he saw a scroll float upward, hover, and disappear through a ceiling gap like a truth unwilling to be pinned. He was given a sabbatical. But he might not have been wrong. Because air currents in domes can behave strangely. You see it today with indoor drones. They can spiral upwards if caught in a thermal lift. Why not scrolls? Another scroll, reportedly a treatise on divination using bird shadows, was found weeks later wedged into a ceiling crack. The only reason anyone saw it? A passing bird pecked at the parchment and dropped it onto a philosopher mid-lecture. Proof, the philosopher said. The gods wish us to reread this one. Perhaps. You sit on the edge of a toppled bench now, trying to imagine the chaos. Scribes diving to catch unraveling scrolls. Apprentices shielding their ink pots like sacred relics. One man reportedly shouted, "Every scroll for itself," and fled, clutching the erotic jokes of Aristophanes to his chest. Honestly, you get it. Because scrolls were expensive. Some took months to copy. Some were irreplaceable. One-off diplomatic treaties. Translations from now-dead tongues. Scribbled footnotes from lost empires. And all it took was one gust to send them flying. After the stampede, the library changed. Scroll rods were redesigned with air catchers, small notches carved along the inner edge to catch wind and prevent rolling. Shelves were built with slight upward tilts, like ski slopes in reverse. Scrolls were bound in clusters, tied not just for preservation, but to give them weight, so they'd have to mutiny together. Still, fear lingered. Some librarians started anchoring scrolls with soft leather straps, not nailed, but gently buckled. Easy to release. Harder to fly. And the guards? They carried nets. Yes. Nets. Because sometimes you don't need a sword. You need something to catch a flying timeline before it clocks you in the jaw. You walk toward the far side of the room where a line of scrolls still lie scattered. One in particular catches your eye. It's unmarked. You pick it up. It smells of salt and old fig ink. You unfurl it slowly. The writing is unfinished. Mid-sentence. And then, at the end, a scroll in another hand. The wind took the rest. Forgive me. That was someone's confession. Someone's surrender. And maybe, their warning. Because when a room full of scrolls decides to stampede, it doesn't matter how careful you are. It doesn't matter how well you catalogued. Sometimes, knowledge runs. And sometimes, the wind wins. You leave the stampede chamber behind, cautiously stepping over the last few unraveled scrolls like someone walking through the wake of a long-forgotten storm. The air is calmer here, still. You feel your chest finally release the tension you didn't know it was holding. But it doesn't last. You're entering the oldest part of the library now. And by old, we are not talking worn tiles and creaky hinges. We are talking age that smells different. Like the pages here have soaked up centuries of breath and silence and time itself. It's darker. You move by instinct. The floor slopes gently downward, and the ceiling lowers with each turn, like the library itself is trying to press you closer to its secrets. And secrets it has. Because in these corridors, among these scrolls, words are no longer just information. They are spells. And the people who tend them? They don't read. They whisper. Welcome to the scriptorium of the clerks who whisper spells. You turn a corner and find a long, low hall carved from stone darker than the rest, basalt, maybe. The sconces here burn with blue-tinged oil, casting strange shadows. The shelves are shorter, more tightly packed. Each scroll is wrapped in silk and bound with an odd knot, somewhere between a sailor's tie and a prayer gesture. You recognize it. It's a binding spell. Or something close. Because in this part of the library, ink isn't just pigment. It's intention. And every scroll here is a message meant to stay put. There's a desk in the center of the room. Not large, not ornate. Just clean. Deliberate. A small pot of dried herbs rests in the corner, rosemary, sage, and something darker. And in the wall above the desk? A hole. A tiny one. Barely large enough for a finger. A breath hole. You step closer, kneel, and realize what this room is for. You don't read scrolls here. You let them read you. The clerks who worked in this wing, the whisper scribes, the ink binders, they were responsible for the most dangerous scrolls. The ones that couldn't be shouted. The ones that needed to be lulled. Because if they weren't, well, let's just say smudged ink would be the least of your concerns. Mainstream historical fact? In several ancient libraries, including those in Hattusa, Pergamon, and Memphis, certain texts were considered so powerful that scribes were instructed to copy them only under specific moon phases, with ritual cleansings, and in total silence. They were called living words. Dangerous, volatile, sensitive. In Alexandria, these texts were kept underground and tended with whispers. Scribes here developed a practice called scroll anchoring. Before opening a scroll, they would hum, not just any tune, but a note tuned to the scroll's last known emotional alignment. Were they serious about this? Completely. They believed scrolls had moods. That they remembered how they'd been handled. That they responded to gentleness. That a scroll unrolled in frustration would respond in kind, with misreadings, gaps, or missing lines. Some took it further. They spoke to the scrolls. Not conversationally. Ritualistically. Like caretakers soothing a fevered patient. You find one scroll now. Its bindings are looser. Its silk wrap is stained with age. Someone left it partially unrolled on a pedestal. The words are careful, measured, Greek, but with strange spacing. And under every fifth line? A whisper glyph. Tiny curls in faint ink. Inconspicuous. But present. A cloak's chant, written not for readers, but for the scroll itself. The glyphs mean something like hold, settle, rest, stay. Because if the scrolls stayed calm, so would the wind. Fringe theory? Some believe the whispers created sonic residue, soft vibrations that lingered on the parchment like static. When disturbed by airflow, these residues would remind the scroll of its purpose, coaxing it to remain intact. Historians still argue whether this was protoacoustics or just very dedicated librarians talking to their paperwork. But it worked. Mostly. Except when it didn't. You find a notation carved into the desk. 3 glyphs failed. 1 scroll fled. We stitched the memory shut. It's cryptic. But you suspect it refers to a lost text. Maybe one that literally came apart. Or one that changed. Because here's the scariest part. Sometimes, the scrolls rewrote themselves. Not magically. Mechanically. Ink, disturbed by a breeze. Words, realigned by a shift in the parchment's tension. One phrase, becoming another. There's a recorded case of a sacred hymn to the sun that, over time, turned into a dirge for the sea. Same letters. Different spacing. Different breaks. Scholars noticed. Argued. Some claimed it was divine evolution. The whisper clerks knew better. It was wind. So they adapted. They began to whisper phrases not just to calm the scrolls, but to anchor the meanings. These weren't mere chants. They were preventative charms, spoken aloud while copying, breathed between every third word. Some clerks even developed breath patterns. Breathe in before a noun. Breathe out after a verb. Rhythm. Ritual. Reliability. And if your breathing faltered? So did the scroll. There's a haunting story of a clerk named Nennet who stuttered when nervous. Assigned to a prophecy scroll, he tried to compensate with extra humming. The scroll blurred. Words began to curl backward. The ink pulled into spirals. They called it a reverse breath collapse. Nennet never spoke again. After that, the whisper clerks were chosen for their calm. Their stillness. Their silence. You pause now, holding one of the older scrolls in your hands. You feel the rough texture of its outer wrap, the weight of its rod ends, carved obsidian, unusually heavy. And on the inside, barely visible beneath the top layer, you see it. A fingerprint. Ink-stained. Long faded. Pressed there 1,000 years ago. A mark left by someone who whispered to this scroll. Who asked it not to betray its contents to the wind. Because sometimes, even the air listens for secrets. And when it finds them, it moves. Just enough. Just fast enough. To lift one letter. Shift one space. And suddenly, your spell to heal the king becomes a recipe for famine. So you tie the scroll again. Carefully. Mindfully. With both hands steady. And you whisper, not a word. Just a breath. Soft and sure. So that this scroll, like so many others, might remember. It is not alone. It is not forgotten. And it does not need to flee. You rise slowly from the whisper chamber, your footsteps light, your breath quiet, as if the very air has trained you now to respect it. Even your clothes feel different, heavier with awareness. You walk like someone who knows the ink is watching. The hallway outside opens into a wide rotunda lined with star maps, painted in gold leaf and blue dye long faded into bruised indigo. Here, The ceiling stretches high, forming a dome pierced with small windows angled upward. It feels more celestial than the rest of the library. Almost official. This was the council dome, where scholars, philosophers, and imperial delegates would consult ancient knowledge, argue about truth, and make decisions that could redirect armies, redraw borders, or redefine gods. All based on what the scrolls said. And that, of course, made the wind especially dangerous. Because in this dome, a single misplaced word could become war. You step forward and run your hand over a pedestal at the center. It's octagonal, 8 sides for 8 realms of knowledge. Philosophy, medicine, astronomy, law, poetry, trade, ritual, history. The scroll holders above each side are empty now, but the shadows remain. This is where the wind lied to emperors. Not because it was malevolent, but because it was present. Mainstream historical fact? Ancient rulers often relied on written consultation, messages from advisors, transcriptions of oracles, copies of treaties. These weren't verbal summaries or memories. These were scrolls. Tangible. Permanent. So they believed. But scrolls, as you've learned, move. Ink fades. Pages curl. Gaps widen. A loop of a letter becomes an O instead of an E. A space between words stretches, and 2 become 1. One king's order to spare the rebels was mistranslated as spread the rebels. A request to fortify a city became an order to forfeit it. The consequences? Lost provinces. Burned ports. Mass graves. Of course, no one blamed the wind directly. Not in public. But in the footnotes? The diaries? The marginalia? Oh, they knew. You moved to the side alcove where political scrolls were once stored. The racks here are thicker. The rods, heavier. Some scrolls were copied in triplicate, quadruple, quintuple. Redundancy was key. But even that failed when the scrolls were read in the wrong room. Yes. Location mattered. Remember how earlier, the shelves seemed to alter meaning based on air currents? In this council dome, it was worse. Air entered from 8 distinct vents, designed to symbolize the 8 winds, the 8 directions of thought. Beautiful concept. Terrible execution. Because different scrolls reacted differently to each wind. Some curled under Notos, the wet southern gust. Others faded under Boreas, the dry northern blast. And when 2 winds met in the middle, oh, that's when scrolls cracked. Literally. Like old bread crust. Fringe record? A scribe once blamed the collapse of a diplomatic meeting on a scroll that crumpled in protest. It was a weather chart. The ink ran. The date was unreadable. The forecast misread. The delegation wore the wrong ceremonial color. Offense was taken. Talks ended. 2 provinces declared independence. All because of airflow. Historians still argue whether that story is exaggeration or just absurd enough to be true. But it points to a deeper fear. That wind could reshape the past. Imagine being a ruler, reading your ancestors' proclamation, and realizing, too late, that the text has been subtly rearranged. That what you took as permission was actually prohibition. That your conquest was meant to be a peace treaty. And if you question the scroll, you're questioning the very source of truth. So emperors stopped trusting scribes. They demanded oracles of the air. Yes. That's a thing. You walk now to a curved bench where orator scribes once stood. They read aloud from scrolls during windless hours, verifying aloud what was written before the emperor or his envoys. But here's the catch. They had to read it fast, before the wind returned. A clever workaround, but deeply flawed. What if the scroll changed mid-reading? What if the meaning drifted? So some scribe priests developed binding language, phrases locked in double negatives, redundancies, and repetitions to guard against accidental ambiguity. The more annoying the sentence, the harder it was to misinterpret. You've probably read ancient proclamations that feel like they're speaking in loops. Now you know why. They were windproofing. And sometimes, they failed anyway. There's a scroll here now. You kneel to examine it. The first word is clear, decree. The next few are muddled. But one phrase leaps out. If misread, let consequence return to sender. A scroll that cursed its own distortion. An anti-like clause. Paranoia? Absolutely. But in a world where the wind might move letters, it was better to be safe. One emperor reportedly carried his favorite scroll in a sealed ivory tube and refused to unroll it unless the room was blessed by 5 priests and verified with bird entrails. The scroll was blank, by the way. Just a show of control. You rise, moving toward the final chamber in the dome. The room of maps. This is where wind's betrayal becomes irreversible. Because if a sentence can mislead an emperor, a map can mislead an entire world. You pass rows of ancient cartography, scrolls with shorelines, trade routes, river bends. And you see the damage. Edges warped by drafts. Inks faded from salt mist. Entire cities relocated by accident, or air. Some maps were copied in different orientations because the original scroll had curled the wrong way. North became east. Mountains became waves. Desert outposts were placed underwater. And empires launched based on these errors. Ships were sent. Armies marched. Tributes demanded from kingdoms that didn't exist. Because someone read a map beside a cracked window. Or in a room where the broom wind stirred the sea lanes into snakes. You pause before one such scroll, rolled tight and sealed with gold thread. A tiny tag reads, "The wind's truth." A nickname? Or a confession? You don't unroll it. You don't dare. Because this room, this dome, this whole towering monument to certainty, was built on scrolls. And scrolls, you now know, are fragile, are fallible, are followers of the wind. And sometimes, when that wind was feeling particularly bold, it didn't just carry away knowledge. It rewrote the orders of kings. You descend one final staircase, narrow and steep, spiraling like the grooves in an ammonite shell. The stone here is smoother, darker, colder. There's no torchlight anymore, just the faint glow of bioluminescent lichen laced across the walls like lazy constellations. This is the bottom of it all. The final vault. The place where the last scrolls were kept before the world forgot them. And here, the wind doesn't whistle. It waits. You arrive in a chamber shaped like a teardrop, just wide enough for 6 scroll shelves, a stone pedestal in the middle, and a bench along the back wall, smooth from centuries of quiet sitting. There's no movement. No creak. No echo. Only you. And one scroll. resting on the pedestal. Its ends are bound in iron. Not decorative. Necessary. The silk wrap is frayed, bleached pale by age. A scrap of tag remains, the ink too faded to read. But you know what this is? The last scroll. The one that vanished. The one that carried everything no one else got to know. The one the wind took away. Not stolen. Freed. Because scrolls, like people, long to be known. And sometimes, when knowledge is kept too tightly bound, the universe intervenes. The story goes like this. In the final days of the library, some say after a fire, some say after a war, some say after nothing at all, a single breeze made it inside. Just one. Through a cracked window, through a forgotten vent, across the rotunda of lost maps, down the halls of whispering clerks, past the scroll stampede scars and ink-flood benches and turtle-shell shelves. And it found this scroll. The unknown one. The one no one read. Not because it was forbidden, but because it was too strange. Too unstructured. Too fluid. Too alive. Some say it whispered when opened. That its letters rearranged themselves. That if you read it twice, it changed its ending. Others say it was blank until the wind arrived. And then, only then, it spoke. They say it unfurled on its own. Just a little. Just enough to taste the air. And then it rose. Not flew. Floated. Carried not by a gust, not by force, but by agreement. By invitation. No one stopped it. They stood, stunned, as the scroll lifted from the pedestal and hovered. Its ends curled slightly, like a smile. And then it drifted upward. Up through the shafts. Past the scriptoriums. Past the domes and vents and pigeon wards. Past the scrolls still whispering their warnings. And then it left. Into the sky. Gone. That's the legend. The librarians didn't mourn. They lit a lamp. They recited the phrase reserved only for texts no longer shelvable. Let it find the ones who breathe it best. And they closed the vault. You're here now, standing before the pedestal. And what you see isn't a scroll. It's the weight of 1,000 questions. Because maybe the wind didn't take it. Maybe the scroll wanted to go. To carry its secrets where no shelf could hold them. To leave the rot and the dust and the salt and the scroll rot and the pigeon talons and the whispers and the drafty halls. Maybe knowledge isn't meant to sit still forever. Maybe truth needs to be lifted. And so, you sit. Quiet. Still. You don't open the scroll. You just breathe. And the air, thicker now, warmer, wraps around you like a soft shawl. Like gratitude. And somewhere, far above the dome, the wind waits. Not as enemy, but as messenger. Because in the end, the librarians didn't fear the wind for what it could take. They feared it for what it could carry away. And now, perhaps, what it might bring back. So now, as the final scroll settles into memory, and the softest gust brushes the edge of your thoughts, let's let the pace slow. Your breathing deepens. Your shoulders lower. The story doesn't need to go on anymore. Let it rest. You're surrounded, now, by quiet stone walls. Warm lamplight flickers in a rhythm that matches your breath. Somewhere in the distance, a faint breeze slips through a corridor, but gently this time. Not to stir scrolls or shift meaning, just to say goodnight. The librarians are gone. The scribes have set down their pens. Even the shelves seem to exhale softly, empty and calm. The ghosts of the past are content, their whispers finally fading. And you? You've wandered deep into time, into quiet, into understanding. Maybe the wind isn't something to fear. Maybe it's the breath of stories moving on. There's nothing you need to do now. No scrolls to straighten. No pages to press. No whispers to hush. Only stillness. And the soft sound of your own heart slowing. So let the wind pass gently by your window. Let it hum through the corners of your room like it once hummed through the library halls. It's not here to rewrite you. It's here to remind you that even the quietest knowledge still wants to be heard. Sleep well, friend. Let the scrolls rest. Let the wind speak.